It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, a tropical getaway to heal their strained marriage. But beneath the surface of paradise, one woman would discover the ultimate betrayal. And within 48 hours, her husband would be dead. How did a dream vacation turn into a deadly nightmare? And what dark secrets had he been hiding all along? It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Maria and her husband Daniel had been planning this tropical vacation for months. Their relationship after a decade of marriage had seen its ups and downs, but they were determined to rekindle the spark. The gentle sound of the waves crashing on the shore, the golden sand beneath their feet, and the warm, salty breeze made everything feel serene, at least on the surface. For Maria, this trip was more than just a getaway. It was a chance to reconnect with the man she had loved for so many years. She believed this would be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one free of the stress and tension that had recently crept into their marriage. But little did she know, Daniel was carrying a secret that would shatter her world. On the third day of their vacation, something strange caught Maria's attention. Daniel had become more distant, often sneaking off to take phone calls. He would excuse himself with vague reasons, work emergencies, or checking in with a friend. But each time his expression would darken before he stepped away, his voice low and urgent. Maria dismissed it at first, telling herself that maybe Daniel was just stressed from work. But as the days passed, his behavior became harder to ignore. Then one evening, as Daniel went for what he claimed was a quick swim, Maria decided to check his phone. It wasn't something she had ever done before. She had always trusted him, but there was a nagging feeling in her gut that wouldn't let go. Unlocking the phone, she immediately saw a message notification flash across the screen. The name Clara appeared, followed by a text that made Maria's heart drop. "The kids miss you. When will you be back?" Her mind raced. Who was Clara? And why was she talking about kids? Maria quickly scrolled through the messages, her breath catching as the reality of what she was reading set in. For the past 3 years, Daniel had been living a double life. He had a second family, a wife, Clara, and 2 young children. And Maria was just discovering the horrifying truth. Maria's hands trembled as she scrolled further through the messages. There were photos. Daniel with Clara, smiling as they sat at a dinner table. Daniel holding a small boy, no more than 4 or 5 years old, as they played in a park. And then, the worst of it all, Daniel had planned to meet Clara and the kids after their vacation. He had told her he was on a business trip, the very same trip he had invited Maria on to reconnect. Maria couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened and her world started spinning. This wasn't just a casual affair. It was an entirely separate life. A second wife, 2 children, and years of deceit. The man she thought she knew, the man she shared her life with, had been lying to her for years, building a future with someone else. She put the phone down, pacing around the room in disbelief. Memories of the last few years flooded back, moments that now seemed tainted with Daniel's lies. All the times he was working late, all the business trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere, it all made sense now. He wasn't working late or traveling for business. He was spending time with them, with his other family. Maria felt sick. She wanted to scream, to confront him immediately, but she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to understand the full extent of his betrayal before she could face him. She needed to know just how long he had been lying to her, and more importantly, why. She sat back down and began reading the messages again, combing through every detail. Clara's messages were casual, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "The kids loved the zoo last weekend," one read. "Don't forget to bring Emma her favorite doll when you come back," said another. It was clear that Clara had no idea Maria existed. To Clara, Daniel was a loving husband and father. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she thought about what her life had become. What had she done to deserve this? How could Daniel betray her like this? She had stood by his side through everything, his career struggles, family issues, all of it. And now she was discovering that he had been living a lie. The weight of the truth was unbearable, and Maria felt as though she were drowning in it. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself much longer. But before she confronted Daniel, she needed to plan. She needed to be prepared for whatever explanation or excuse he might give. After all, this wasn't just about infidelity. This was something much deeper, much darker. The rest of the evening passed in agonizing silence. Daniel returned from his swim, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Maria. She watched him as he moved around the room, casually chatting about dinner plans, smiling as if nothing was wrong. But Maria's mind was miles away, trapped in the nightmare she had uncovered just hours before. Her stomach churned as she replayed the text messages and photos over and over in her mind. How could he stand there, pretending everything was normal? How could he lie so easily? The weight of the truth pressed down on her, but she bit her tongue, forcing herself to stay composed. If she lashed out now, it would be in anger, an uncontrolled fury that might not lead to the answers she needed. She needed more than an emotional release. She needed the truth, the full story. That night, Maria barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Daniel slept soundly beside her. His even breathing only made her more furious. How could he sleep so peacefully, knowing the pain he was causing? The betrayal ate at her, gnawing at her heart until it felt like there was nothing left but a hollow ache. Morning came, but with it, no relief. Maria decided that today would be the day. She would confront him. The thought terrified her, but she knew it was the only way forward. She couldn't go on pretending like everything was fine. The lies were suffocating her, and she needed to know why. Why had Daniel done this to her? How had he managed to live two lives without her ever suspecting? As they sat down for breakfast at the resort cafe, Maria could barely look at him. Every word out of his mouth sounded false. Every smile seemed like part of an act she had unknowingly been a part of for years. The truth sat on the tip of her tongue, but she held it back. Not here, not in public. She wanted to confront him in private, where there would be no distractions, no escape for him. After breakfast, they walked back to their room. Daniel, completely unaware of the emotional storm inside Maria, talked about taking a day trip to a nearby island. Maria could barely respond, her thoughts consumed with the confrontation she had planned. As soon as they reached the room, she turned to face him. Her heart pounded in her chest and her hands trembled, but she couldn't hold back any longer. "Daniel," she said, her voice low but steady, "we need to talk." He looked up, surprised by the sudden seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" he asked, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. "I know about Clara. I know about the kids." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and then, slowly, to something darker, something Maria had never seen in him before. The mask he had been wearing for years finally cracked, and Maria saw the truth in his eyes before he could even say a word. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask how she found out. He just stared at her, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Maria," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can explain." But Maria wasn't sure she wanted to hear his explanation. The truth was already laid bare before her, and it was more devastating than anything she could have imagined. "Explain?" Maria's voice trembled, barely containing the flood of emotions threatening to burst through. She took a step back, her mind spinning. "Explain what exactly, Daniel? That you have a whole other family? That you've been lying to me for years? What could you possibly say that would make any of this okay?" Daniel's face was drained of color, his usual calm demeanor shattered. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out at first. Maria could see him struggling, trying to piece together a story that might salvage what little remained between them, but nothing could. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too profound. "Please, just listen," he said finally, his voice desperate. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted you to find out this way." Maria let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, so you were planning on telling me at some point. When? After the vacation? Or were you going to sneak off to be with them while I was still trying to hold together this sham of a marriage?" Daniel winced at her words, and for a moment there was silence. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze darting away from Maria's piercing stare. I made a mistake," he said, the words barely audible. "A huge mistake. It wasn't meant to go this far. When I met Clara, things were different back then. You and I were going through a rough patch. I didn't know how to handle it, and You what? You decided to start a new life with someone else instead of fixing the one you already had? Maria's voice was rising now, the anger she had held back for so long spilling out. Daniel stepped toward her, but Maria recoiled. She didn't want him near her. Not now, not ever. I was lost, Daniel said, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. Clara, she doesn't know about you either. I've been living a lie with both of you. I didn't know how to get out. I never wanted to hurt you, Maria, I swear. Maria's stomach churned at his words. The way he spoke as if he were the victim made her skin crawl. You're unbelievable, she spat. You didn't want to hurt me? How could you even say that? You've destroyed me, Daniel. You've shattered everything we built together. Our marriage, our trust, our life. It's all a lie now. And for what? For another family? Daniel's eyes were full of regret, but Maria wasn't sure if he regretted what he had done or just that he had been caught. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice hollow. I just wanted to explain. I was going to end it with Clara. I was going to come back to you, fully. End it? Maria shook her head, disbelieving. You have children with her, Daniel. This isn't something you can just walk away from like it never happened. You've created two separate lives, two entire families, and now you want to act like you can pick one and everything will be fine. Daniel was silent, unable to respond. The weight of his lies, of everything he had done, seemed to press down on him. He slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Maria watched him, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw things, to lash out at him physically for the pain he had caused. Another part of her wanted to leave, to never see him again. But there was still so much she didn't understand. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told? And most importantly, what was she going to do now? How long, Daniel? Maria asked quietly, her voice trembling. How long have you been lying to me? Daniel hesitated before answering. 3 years, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. 3 years. Maria's heart sank even further. For 3 long years he had carried on this charade, pretending to be the loving husband while secretly living another life. How many moments had they shared during those years that had been nothing more than a performance? How many times had he looked her in the eyes and lied? Maria felt like the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her in freefall. You disgust me, she whispered, turning away from him. She couldn't look at him any longer. Every second in his presence made her feel like she was suffocating under the weight of his betrayal. But as she stood there, staring out the window at the ocean waves crashing against the shore, a new thought crept into her mind, one that both terrified and consumed her. She had trusted him with everything, and now everything she knew was a lie. What was she supposed to do now? Could she leave him? Could she move on from this? Or would the betrayal fester inside her until it destroyed everything she had ever been? The questions clawed at her mind, and for the first time, Maria wondered if she could ever truly escape the web of deceit that Daniel had woven around her life. Maria stood frozen, her back turned to Daniel, staring out at the vast ocean beyond the window. She could hear him breathing behind her, could sense his remorse, but it did nothing to soothe the burning fury inside her. Every wave that crashed against the shore seemed to echo the same relentless question in her mind. What now? For a few moments she stayed silent, letting the weight of everything settle, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just walk away from this. How could she leave him with so little consequence after what he had done? The betrayal was too deep, too raw, and the fact that he had sat there, explaining away his double life as if it were some momentary lapse in judgment, made her sick. The rage that had been simmering inside her since the discovery began to boil over. She needed to take control. She needed to make him understand the full weight of what he had done. The thought of Daniel slipping away, returning to that other life, perhaps living happily with his second family while she picked up the pieces of her own shattered existence. It was unbearable. No, he couldn't just move on from this. Not after everything he had put her through. A dangerous thought began to form in Maria's mind. What if she didn't leave? What if she made sure Daniel could never lie again? She turned back to face him, her expression cold and unreadable. Daniel looked up from where he sat, his face etched with guilt and confusion. "Maria, I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I just want—" She cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "No," she said quietly, her voice like ice. "You don't get to fix this. You don't get to come back from this. You've ruined everything." Daniel blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "What are you talking about?" he asked cautiously, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed the change in her. Maria took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled, but she balled them into fists to steady herself. She was no longer afraid. She had given Daniel everything, her trust, her love, her life, and in return, he had destroyed it all. Now it was time for him to face the consequences. "You said you wanted to end it with her, right?" Maria continued, her voice low and venomous. "You were going to come back to me, make things right? Like none of this ever happened?" Daniel hesitated, his brow furrowing as if he was unsure where this was going. "Yes, I just need time. I need to sort everything out." Maria let out a slow, bitter laugh. "Time? You think time is going to fix this? You think you can just walk away from the mess you made?" The room grew colder as her words hung in the air. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "You've been lying to me for 3 years, Daniel." 3 years, Maria hissed, her voice rising with each word. "And now you expect me to just sit here while you figure things out? To wait for you to decide which family you want to keep?" Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as Maria stepped even closer, her face inches from his. The look in her eyes was one he had never seen before. Dark, hollow, filled with a rage that he hadn't realized was there. "Maria, please," he stammered. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," she whispered, her voice chillingly calm. "You hurt me more than you'll ever understand. And now I have to live with that. But you don't get to walk away from this, Daniel." Daniel stood, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. But it was too late. Maria had already made her decision. She had given him her heart, her trust, and her soul, and he had crushed it without a second thought. Now there was nothing left but the empty void where her love had once been, replaced by a cold, consuming fury. "Maria," he said, his voice shaking, "we can figure this out. We can fix this. I'll leave Clara. Before he could finish, Maria's hand shot out, grabbing a heavy glass ornament from the table beside her. Without thinking, without hesitation, she swung it with all her might. The glass shattered against the side of Daniel's head with a sickening thud. Daniel staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he stumbled backward. Blood began to trickle down the side of his face, mixing with shards of glass that had lodged into his skin. He reached up to touch the wound, his hand trembling, and for a moment he looked at Maria with a kind of stunned disbelief. "Maria," he gasped, barely able to speak as the room began to spin around him. But Maria didn't stop. The rage, the betrayal, it all came flooding out in that single moment. She lunged forward, striking him again, harder this time. Daniel collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around his body as his breathing grew shallow. Maria stood over him, her chest heaving, the broken ornament still clutched in her trembling hand. She watched as the life slowly drained from his eyes, and for the first time since she had uncovered his lies, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was done. Maria stood frozen in the silence that followed, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. The room around her felt distant, as if she were watching the scene unfold from outside her body. The ornament slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud, the sound almost imperceptible over the roar of blood pounding in her ears. Daniel lay motionless at her feet, his blood soaking into the carpet. His once vibrant eyes she had looked into countless times over the years, were now dull and empty. The reality of what she had done crashed into her like a wave. The anger that had driven her to this point evaporated, leaving behind only a cold, hollow feeling in its wake. For a moment, Maria couldn't move. She stood there staring down at him, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. She had killed him. In her fury, in her heartbreak, she had taken his life. Her hands shook as she knelt down beside him, as if by some miracle she could undo what had been done. But there was no undoing this. Daniel was gone, and it was by her hand. The minutes passed in a blur. Maria's heart raced as her thoughts spiraled out of control. What had she done? What was she supposed to do now? She couldn't think clearly. Everything was a haze of disbelief and panic. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door pulled her from her daze. Her heart stopped. Panic surged through her veins and her gaze darted toward the door. Had someone heard something? She glanced down at herself. Blood spattered across her clothes, her hands trembling as they were stained red with the evidence of her crime. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She had to act, but her mind was racing too fast to think clearly. If anyone saw her like this, it would be over. She had to clean up, hide the evidence, and get away. But how? She grabbed a towel from the nearby dresser and began wiping her hands, her movements frantic and uneven. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to escape the nightmare she had created, but her legs felt like lead. Her mind kept returning to the same question: what have I done? The knocking finally stopped, and whoever had been at the door seemed to leave. Relief washed over her, but only for a brief moment. The reality of the situation pressed down on her again. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. Maria's hands shook as she rushed to the bathroom, splashing water on her face, trying to remove the blood from her skin. But no amount of scrubbing could erase the stains that now seemed to be imprinted on her soul. The guilt, the horror, the regret, it all weighed down on her, crushing her chest. But there was no time to grieve, no time to fall apart. She had to move, to act. She had to make it look like an accident, something that could explain this terrible scene. But how could she? How could she cover up the truth of what she had done? Her mind raced through possibilities as she stumbled back into the room, staring at Daniel's lifeless body on the floor. Think, Maria. Think, she told herself, but her thoughts were scattered, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out any coherent plan. The blood was everywhere, and the room reeked of violence. How could she possibly explain this? The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick and suffocating. And then a terrifying thought struck her. Even if she could cover this up, even if no one ever found out, could she live with herself? The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway, snapping Maria out of her panicked trance. She had to act fast. It wasn't just about cleaning the mess anymore. It was about survival. She rushed to the closet, grabbing one of Daniel's suitcases. If she could get rid of his body, maybe she could buy herself some time. Maybe she could think more clearly. She knelt down beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to move his body. But he was heavy, far too heavy for her to handle alone. The suitcase idea was impossible, and now it seemed ridiculous even to her panicked mind. She would never be able to carry him without drawing attention. What had she been thinking? There was no easy way out of this. Maria's pulse quickened. Her options were slipping away, and every minute that passed made it harder to cover her tracks. Her mind raced with potential lies, alibis that might explain what had happened. Maybe she could say it was an accident, that they had been arguing and she had struck him in self-defense. Maybe people would believe that she had no choice. But would they? Or would they see through her? Would they know that her anger had boiled over, that she had taken matters into her own hands in a moment of blinding rage? Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, jolting her back into the present. She scrambled to grab it, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. A message flashed across the screen, a text from Clara. "Are you coming back soon? The kids miss you." Maria's blood ran cold. Clara, the second family, the one he had been planning to return to after their vacation. Suddenly, the enormity of her situation became painfully clear. It wasn't just her life that had been destroyed. It was Clara's too, and the children. Those innocent kids who had no idea what had just happened. Maria's anger had blinded her to the fact that she wasn't the only victim of Daniel's lies. The phone buzzed again in her hand. Another message from Clara. "Daniel, Is everything okay?" Maria's fingers hovered over the screen. What should she do? Should she reply? Should she pretend to be Daniel, stringing Clara along just long enough to buy herself more time? Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. If she didn't respond, Clara might become suspicious. If she did respond, she would be entering into a dangerous game of deception. But what choice did she have? She couldn't let Clara find out, not yet. With a deep breath, Maria typed out a quick response. "Everything's fine. Just need some time." Her hands were shaking as she hit send. She stared at the message for a moment, feeling the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. She was in too deep. The thought of running away, of leaving this place and never looking back, crossed her mind again. But where could she go? There was nowhere to hide from the truth. No escape from the crime she had committed. The walls were closing in, and the lies she was spinning were beginning to suffocate her. As she looked back at Daniel's body, the enormity of her situation hit her with full force. This wasn't just about covering up a crime anymore. This was about survival, about trying to piece together the remnants of her shattered life before it all came crashing down. But deep down, Maria knew the truth. No matter how far she ran, no matter how well she hid her tracks, she couldn't outrun what she had done. The guilt, the horror, it would follow her wherever she went, haunting her every step. The minutes dragged on, each second ticking by like a drumbeat pounding in Maria's chest. She stood there, her mind racing, her hands still trembling from the horrific act she had just committed. The message to Clara had bought her a little time, but not much. Sooner or later, Clara would expect more than a vague reply. Sooner or later, someone would come looking for Daniel. Her mind flashed through possibilities. Could she leave the resort? Just pack up her things, walk out, and disappear? But where would she go? What about the CCTV cameras around the hotel? Her name was on the reservation. Her fingerprints were all over the room. There was no easy way to vanish without a trace. As Maria paced back and forth, her eyes fell on the blood-soaked carpet once again. The stark reality of what she had done was staring back at her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. There was no undoing this, no rewinding the clock. And even if she somehow managed to escape detection, could she live with the weight of this crime on her conscience? She tried to steady her breathing, tried to think clearly, but it was impossible. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air too thick to breathe. Every noise from the hallway made her jump. It was only a matter of time before someone came knocking again, and this time, they wouldn't go away. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Clara. "Daniel, are you okay? You're not answering my calls. Please tell me what's going on." Maria's heart raced as she stared at the phone. Clara was growing more suspicious. It wouldn't be long before she started calling incessantly, or worse, trying to contact someone else to check on Daniel. Maria's hands shook as she debated what to do next. Should she send another reply? Should she pretend that everything was fine? Could she keep up this charade long enough to figure out a way out of this mess? But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, Maria knew it was futile. Clara would eventually find out, and there was no way she could maintain the lie forever. Her mind turned to darker possibilities. Could she frame the murder as an accident? Could she make it look like Daniel had fallen, hit his head, and died? But there was too much blood, too many signs of violence. It would be impossible to explain away. The phone buzzed again, jolting her back to the present. This time it wasn't a message, it was a call. Clara. The name flashed on the screen and Maria's heart nearly stopped. She stared at the phone, frozen, as it rang in her hand. What was she supposed to do? If she didn't answer, it would only raise more suspicion. But if she did, how could she possibly explain the situation? The phone continued to ring, each vibration a sharp reminder of the web of lies she was now entangled in. Finally, with a shaky hand, Maria silenced the call. She couldn't answer. Not now. Not like this. But as the phone went quiet, a new dread washed over her. Clara wouldn't stop, and if Clara couldn't reach Daniel, she would keep calling, keep searching for answers until she found them. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Maria's world was unraveling faster than she could keep up. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, and the crushing weight of guilt was suffocating. She stumbled toward the bathroom, her reflection in the mirror a stranger, her face pale, eyes wide with panic, and blood staining her clothes like a grotesque reminder of what she had done. She splashed water on her face, trying to wake herself from this living nightmare. But the cold sting of the water did nothing to shake her out of her reality. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't something she could just walk away from. The enormity of it all came crashing down on her with terrifying force. She glanced back toward the room, her eyes falling once again on Daniel's lifeless body. In a moment of blind rage, she had taken everything from him, and in doing so, had destroyed her own life as well. There was no going back now, no way to fix what she had broken. The man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way, was gone, and she was the one responsible. As her panic grew, Maria's thoughts turned darker. There was no way out of this. Not really. She could run, but for how long? She could lie, but for how long? The truth would catch up to her eventually, no matter how carefully she tried to cover her tracks. The police would investigate, they would find the evidence, and she would be caught. And even if she wasn't, how could she live with herself? How could she wake up every day knowing what she had done? Her phone buzzed again, a constant reminder of the life she had shattered. This time it was a voicemail from Clara, her voice filled with concern and confusion. "Daniel, please, I'm getting worried. Call me back as soon as you can. The kids are asking about you." The sound of Clara's voice, so innocent, so unaware, sent a chill down Maria's spine. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay, that she hadn't just destroyed multiple lives in a single moment of fury. Her hands trembling, Maria walked back into the room. She stood over Daniel's body, her breath shallow, her mind swirling with guilt and fear. The only thing she knew for sure was that there was no fixing this. No running, no hiding, no covering up. Maria reached for the phone one last time. Her fingers hovered over the dial pad as she stared down at Daniel, the enormity of her actions pressing in on her like a vice. She knew what she had to do, even if it was the hardest thing she had ever faced. With a shaky breath, she dialed 911. In the end, the weight of secrets is always too much to bear. Lives are shattered, trust is broken, and in moments of rage, choices are made that can never be undone. For Maria, the discovery of her husband's double life was the spark that ignited a tragedy that will echo in the lives of everyone touched by it. We may never know the full extent of the pain caused by betrayal, but one thing is certain. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise, and when it does, the consequences can be devastating. Let this story be a reminder that no secret stays hidden forever, and the lies we tell can lead to a path from which there is no return.